Human beings are very emotional creatures, and I think that within that emotion, we need to express ourselves. And I think that one of the coolest parts of expressing ourselves is music.
Please warm my wiener.
Nigga, no.
I have a gift for you. Tyler, right now, please warm my wiener.
The melodic tunes that we turn to whenever we are down or whenever times get dim. But I think that when I hear the definition of art, I learn to appreciate music even more. Art is the expression of human emotion, is it not? So tell me why I get so giddy when I listen to concept albums. Now, if you don't know what a concept album is, read Wikipedia. If you want an example, I could list off a few. American Idiot by Green Day, Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick Lamar, and yes, The Death of Slim Shady by Eminem. All three of these are examples of concept albums. Albums that have tracks that come together to tell a story. Now, some of these, like the aforementioned Death of Slim Shady, has skit segments that actually show you more of that story through its audio format. Unlike musicals and the greater of all of Broadway, concept albums are like listening to just the soundtrack. Which, don't get me wrong, I can bump the Heathers musical soundtrack any day and get the entire story out of that piece, but for some people, that's not really how you want to listen to music. Unless you're me, that's how I listen to music. But I think that one of the best concept albums that takes this format and tells its story so wonderfully is Trainwreck by Boys Night Out. I know, we're 2 whole minutes into this video and I haven't given you any hint of what this story is about or what this album is trying to convey. And quite honestly, I don't know what it's trying to convey after listening to it over 4 times, but I do know that I love it. And I think that the storytelling that is presented is excellently executed, and I will now get into the core of the video. Trainwreck begins with the track Introducing.
Test, check. Well, he's been released again today, and I'm back where I started, looking over old notes, listening to tapes, wondering how bad I potentially messed up this time. The wound seemed to be healing, and he seems to be getting along, without his appendages, and I know he seemed fine. Seems could be a very dangerous word, especially in this business. It can be fatal.
I think we can all gather that the patient is not mentally well. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a patient. So to save you listening to an entire 4-minute song, I'm going to be summarizing all of these songs in little segments like this in my own little videotapes. Introducing covers a lot of ground and sets most of the scenes for the rest of the album, and with that I think it is one of the most important listens of the album. We get the diagnosis for the patient, who I will be referring to as only the patient for the rest of the album, as he's not really named. The patient is diagnosed with dementia, and it has been eating at his brain and been making him act irrationally. He's been troubled with nightmares that are vivid and very lifelike. So the haunting scene of his deceased wife kicks off the events of the album. The doctor describes their relationship as inseparable, and the line of "we were inseparable" is repeated throughout the album. This man cared about his wife a lot, and these events are shocking to everyone involved, including the listener at this point, as it's a weird thing to open on for a concept album. But on top of us getting the description of a deceased wife, we're also told that he's been released again, and that he doesn't have his appendages. So, obviously, there's a lot of ground to cover with this album, and I'm not going to waste any of your time. For this next section, I have decided to name it Dreaming, Waking, and Sentencing, because I am covering the next 3 songs of the album instead of giving them their own sections. Introducing kind of covered the events of most of them and set up the main story, and these songs are only there to really elaborate. And I think that giving them their own section will just kind of defeat the purpose of me summarizing an album, and this is more for me to introduce this to you and encourage you to go listen to it on your own, as opposed to getting your experience out of this video. Dreaming covers the patient talking about a dream with his wife where he is wrapped up in her, and other lines that just describe the general happenings of the dream. And then he talks about suffocating her with blankets and finding her wrapped in a phone cord. And it's other parts of the song that imply that this is a regular dream and that these terrifying realistic nightmares usually happen. But this time, when he wakes up, it's real. For waking, it covers him calling the cops and him sitting there waiting, reflecting on it. It's in this song and the next that we have the repeated lines of "we were inseparable" and "the smell of her perfume struggles to cover everything." And keep these lines in mind as they will come up again later on. While waiting on the police to arrive, he reflects on his actions and hopes and prays that this isn't real or that this didn't happen. Sentencing is kind of a shorter song too, but generally just covers him being referred to a psych ward and pretty much pleading insanity on it. Sentencing doesn't really cover a lot of depth for the story in comparison to the other songs, and just provides more context as to why the patient is being moved to be a patient, as opposed to him just getting arrested. But yeah, these songs just serve the general purpose of explaining where the patient's wound up, how he's gotten here, and kind of setting up the beginning of what was laid out and introducing. Well, by now, we're a decent way into this album, and I think that with that, let's see how many tracks we have left. Well, let's do this. Medicating is the only track on this entire album to have a music video, and unless the other ones exist, and they are ancient and I can't find them, I don't think they exist. And I think it's really strange that Medicating was the song to get a music video when the rest of the album is so good. Which, I like Medicating, it's one of my favorite tracks, but I think that the music, well, the whole thing is the music technically if you want to be one of those guys, but I think that the instrumentals were enough to warrant the music video as opposed to the actual storyline. But with that, this music video actually provides a lot of key information that can give us a better picturing of this story. And I will not be showing it here because please go listen to this thing on your own, watch that on your own. I'm not your source for this album. You saw a little bit of it in the intro to this entire part of the video. But yeah, Medicating consists of the patient pleading with his doctor that he's sane now, and he's all good now that he's on meds, and he needs to be released. And it repeats for 2 choruses of him pleading to no avail, but at the bridge, he starts saying, "Doctor, doctor, I can't thank you enough." And he really can't thank him enough, because what better way to show your gratitude than the horrors that await us in the next track. I would be lying if I said that I went into the events of this album completely blind, because what happens in Purging is the entire reason that I decided to give this album a listen per recommendation of a good friend. But when fully contextualized with the rest of the album, the events of Purging are still just as haunting as they were when it enticed me to listen to this album. As the beginning of Purging suggests, the first night after the patient's release in Medicating is an eventful one. So it's assumed that the patient works at some kind of sawmill or factory, where there is access to open saw blades, which will come in handy later. Whenever he wakes up, he first goes to the kitchen and grabs a red marker and traces lines on his wrist. We're then given a description whenever he goes to the workplace that all of his co-workers, quote-unquote, couldn't believe he'd show up there, implying that, as I would assume in any kind of town, news of the incident of him killing his wife probably got out. And these are co-workers, family, friends. However close some people get to these people they spend time with in the workplace, they probably knew his wife, or at the very least knew him well enough to know something might have been off with him, or knew him before the dementia started to claim his sanity. The horrific description that we're given is what makes this song so haunting. The red lines upon the patient's wrists were not there just to be put there, but they're markings to mark where the saw blade should cut.
Perfect blade, perfect light, perfect lines, perfect night, perfect picture, complacency, that's all I feel. Slow motion replaces real time, as the horror fills their eyes. These scars will never kill again. Eyes I blue, about I laugh, so the proof that I am just. Eyes I blue, about I breath.
Yeah, the patient cuts his hands off with the saws, and the song closes with him falling over, collapsing from blood loss. And he describes, almost in a condescending, I'm looking down on you way, all of his coworkers coming to see if he's even alive. So, left at this point with our protagonist handless, we cut to the next song.
Last call at the hospital, you slept.
Like I did earlier in this video, this next section will focus on relapsing, recovering, and composing. The three songs that kind of are the falling action of the album so far. In recovering, we cover the surgery process for the proper, amputation of these mutilated hands or arms. But I think we're told that he just has his hands removed because it's implied that he just has no hands. That's what it says. It says no hands and even less skill. I'm assuming that the female voice in the beginning of Recovering is the spirit or hallucination of his deceased wife. But this song covers the kind of rehabilitation in the hospital for the patient, and then Recovering is very similar. Recovering and composing kind of bled together for me, which I am on a fresh listen for this album, but Recovering focuses more on the literal recovery, and then composing has a focus on him trying to tie up loose ends and gain back some of his sanity. The patient calls over the family members of his deceased wife, and we never really get any confirmation as to how that ends for him. But sirloin and steak dinner really makes up for the smothering of their daughter, I'm sure. But things aren't looking very good for Mr. No Hands, and we'll see where things go in the rest of the descent of this album, as now that I've shortened it down to about 4 or less tracks, if not 3, we're nearing the end of this video. Forgive me, love. I've chosen a fitting end to the abusing. This final line rings in the midsection of Disintegrating, and it's at this point that I'm reiterating the trigger warning found at the beginning of this video. This song, as well as the next 2 on the album, cover a lot of suicidal thoughts and suicide itself. So, once again, if you didn't read the warning at the beginning of this video, please click off now. This video is meant to entertain you and not at all in any way harm anyone who views this. My channel is, and has always been, a safe space for people to have fun and be entertained, and I would never want anyone to be unintentionally harmed by one of my videos. Disintegrating covers the degradation and slow mistreatment of the patient's self. It's at this point that we see him describe himself like the town monster, talking about his home being this place where he's kept, locked away, as if he's some kind of disgraceful being that doesn't need to be given any attention. And it's at this point that he reflects on the funeral of his now deceased wife, and reflects on things that she said, about how she blamed a lot of things on the doctor, And you see him start to shift a lot of this blame for these events onto the doctor. And it's at this point that the fitting end to the abusing would be to harm the doctor. And the only way he can harm the doctor is by reassuring those negative thoughts that he had in introducing. Because as he said, in this industry, things can be fatal. Healing is a bit of an oxymoron title for the song, as our patient isn't healing, he's actually reducing himself and slowly dying. And with that, it leads us to our final track of the album, Dying. And with the final track, the patient describes laying on the floor, talking about all of these negative things in this horrible, horrible place, saying that this is where you'll find him. And as much as I really want to play this audio and just show you how awesome this album is, I encourage you to listen to it yourself. The doctor comes into the patient's home to check up on him and see how he's doing, but what he feared had come true. The patient is lying on the ground, slowly, slowly dying. But in his final breath, he's smiling, singing to the doctor. The doctor has failed, but the patient got what he always wanted.
He's not dead yet, but he's close. I failed. This is my fault.
If you're a returning viewer, you know I'm not the best with outros. So, in a short, concise, little moment before I end off this video, thank you for watching. Go listen to Trainwreck by Boys Night Out. And maybe go subscribe to my music channel that I have linked in the description of every video. But now, we've reached the end. And thank you all for watching.